I would like to introduce to you all Dr. James Simon. He's clinical professor at George Washington University. He's president and medical director of IntimMedicine Specialists in Washington, D.C. He is an expert on women's sexual health. His topic today is going to be sex, menopause, and evolution. Really, we could do a whole afternoon on the evolution of menopause, but we're going to gain some very valuable insight from him. So I give you Dr. Simon.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'd like to talk today about sex, menopause, and evolution. And for those who are actually interested in evolution, these may seem like they're inconceivable together. Sex, menopause, evolution. You've heard Dr. Kingsburg talk about oxymorons. Well, the same could be said about sex and menopause and evolution. They don't really seem to go together. I'd like to try and connect them for you and get you to think about menopause in a very, very different way. Charles Darwin, perhaps the father of evolution, said, "False facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often endure long." And that couldn't be more true in our discussion of sex and menopause. This cartoon basically says it all. We have the early animal beginning at the beginning, coming out of the water or the primordial ooze, saying or thinking, eat, survive, reproduce. A land animal now, eat, survive, reproduce. A different land animal, eat, survive, and reproduce. Then some kind of a primate on all fours, eat, survive, and reproduce. And here we are, modern woman. What's it all about? Because within the context of eat, survive, and reproduce, she has lots of other things on her mind, because we humans have consciousness. We can see beyond the biologic. We have psychosocial interactions, and those are all as a result of human evolution. Let's talk about sex for a moment, but in the context of evolution. Cindy Meston and David Buss wrote this wonderful paper several years ago. It's a book, and they describe why women have sex. Now, you'd think that, it would be a very short book, but in fact, this book enumerates more than 150 reasons that women have sex. And while we're going to focus on the biological, that is to say, the reproductive aspects of sex, clearly there are many others. In the book, one of my favorites is revenge sex. I'll leave that to your imagination, but we're going to talk biology. All of you know that normal, healthy women begin having normal menstrual cycles around age 12. A menstrual cycle is basically, as you can see here, the development of an egg in a cycle, ovulation, and then followed by progesterone and either pregnancy or menstruation. And our primate relatives, some of them have the exact same menstrual cycle, including monthly menstrual periods. So imagine that we're living in a cave 50,000 years ago. Would menstrual cycles be a good thing? Maybe not so much. But in fact, human females, since we evolved, have had menstrual cycles. These menstrual cycles are associated, as you can see here in the upper left-hand panel, human menstrual cycle, with rises and falls of estradiol, the principal estrogen of the menstrual cycle, and testosterone, the principal androgen of the menstrual cycle. But if you look at ovulation, here indicated by the vertical line, you can see that estradiol and testosterone both peak very near day 14 and a half, and in fact are associated with ovulation. But if you look at the panel immediately below called human sexual desire, it also peaks right around the time of ovulation, triggering desire to have sex, and that's all about reproduction. So, just to reiterate, a peak in hormones, estradiol and testosterone, relative to ovulation, triggers human sexual female behavior to have sex. And this is not unique. You can look at rodents, as shown in the upper right. This is the rat estrus cycle, and they have nearly the same pattern of hormonal and sexual behavior, except that they have it every 4 days, which may be why there could be a lot of rats if you have an infestation. And monkey sexual desire, or macaque sexual desire, in the panel below the rat estrus cycle, showing her solicitations and approaches peaking at the middle of her estradiol peak. Let's talk about our close relatives, the non-human primates. There are a lot of them, and they vary in color, size, shape, and some of them don't menstruate, and some of them do. They show a very suggestive, inviting derriere sexual parts right before ovulation. There is no mistaking this happens to be a baboon, and there's no mistaking when she is ready to ovulate. The males don't need to have a lot of conversation about it. It's all there, and she presents her backside to him when she is ready to mate. Not different in the apes. This happens to be a bonobo. No, not that bonobo. Bonobos are our favorite sexual primate. Why might that be? Well, they have behaviors like fondling and kissing like humans. They show very pronounced sexual swelling, just like their other primate relatives. And they have lots of sex. I guess that's our way of saying wishful thinking, but they have lots of sex. The females commonly initiate sex, unlike other primates. About a third of the time, they actually have sex face to face, unlike most other animals. They have oral sex, they masturbate, and all of this taken together seem very human. So we'd like bonobos. And they follow the same dictates that I've just outlined for monkeys, macaque monkeys, rats, and humans. Well, what happens when a woman has low sexual desire, and when does that all happen? And you can see that this line illustrated in the squares, which represents low sexual desire in a large population of US women, begins to rise in prevalence at about age 39. After 39, in the early 40s, but clearly before menopause, loss of sexual desire begins to rise above baseline. And it continues to rise until the data runs out at around age 80. Why would that be the case? Rising incidence or prevalence of low sexual desire around age 40? Well, there's lots of potential reasons, but I would submit to you that it's likely because there is a steep and rapid decrease in fertility at that time. Why would Mother Nature waste copulation and sex, an energy requiring event, if it wasn't going to result in pregnancy? So on this slide, you can see age-specific fertility and how it declined. And the dashed lines are the Hutterites. The Hutterites are an agrarian community living in the US and Canada with extraordinary fertility. They came here in the 1800s. There were only about 400 Hutterites that came, but their populations doubled 6 times in 100 years for a variety of reasons. They have early marriages, they have a good diet, they have good medical care, and they believe in the Bible, be fruitful and multiply, and they never use contraception, and it's part of their sacrament to have sex as much as possible. So no contraception, plenty of sex. They've got this be fruitful and multiply. But even their fertility is on a steep downward trend beginning in the mid-30s and progressing rapidly thereafter. Well, what about those triggers we spoke about? This is a complicated slide, but I want to take you through it for 1 minute. These are several different hormones. In the upper panel, free testosterone on the left, androstenedione on the right. These are 2 androgens made in women. And in the middle set of bars, labeled MID, M-I-D, these are hormone levels comparing normal menstruating women at the middle of their cycle, women in their 30s, labeled here young, in the yellow bars, and women in their mid to late 40s in the blue bars. And you can see in the top 2 panels, testosterone and androstenedione, 2 androgens, 2 hormones of desire, are peaking at mid-cycle, as I showed you previously for rats, monkeys, and young humans, illustrated here in the yellow, but missing in women in that post-reproductive era that I've mentioned to you in the mid to late 40s. That trigger for sexual interest is missing. Maybe Mother Nature didn't want it there. You would think that modern women, since they have as many as 450 menstrual cycles, would be having a lot of sex compared to women in colonial times or even women in prehistoric times. Well, this slide isn't really fair because women in prehistoric times, without any contraception, and we presume with longer lactation and child spacing, including times when there wasn't enough food to have enough fat to have menstrual cycles, would have very few of those cycles. Now, in modern times, we have plenty of food. In fact, we have an overweight and obesity epidemic, but we have plenty of food to have fat, which is required for normal menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. So you'd think that modern women would be having a lot of sex. Well, maybe not. Here's one of my favorite images of a bird and a bee and a cell phone. And it's from an article called "Why Are Young People Having So Little Sex?" Because it turns out that millennials are having the least amount of sex in several generations. That's a topic for another day. Let's talk about menopause. You remember my showing this slide to you in a slightly different form to illustrate the normal ovarian cycle of follicular or egg development, ovulation, and subsequent menstruation. On this slide, I've added in a couple of interesting issues. Between the red dashed line and the red ovarian blood vessel, there are a number of early, what we call primordial and primary follicles. These are very early eggs in development, and they're just waiting there for a time to ovulate. But these are the follicles or eggs that a woman loses whether she's menstruating, whether she's ovulating, whether she's pregnant, whether she's on birth control or not. And they undergo a growth and death cycle irrespective of all of those parameters. Think about it. If every woman has about the same number of eggs when she's born, or by the time she gets to her first menstrual cycle, about 100,000 at age 12, why is it that women that have, say, 10 babies go through menopause at age 50? Women who have been on birth control pills their whole lives go through menopause at age 50. And those who have menstrual cycles and babies intermittently go through menopause at about the same time. It's because we humans like to think of the menstrual cycle as ovulating 1 or 2 eggs and depleting the egg supply. When in fact, if you start out with 100,000 eggs and you have 400 or 500 menstrual cycles, the math just doesn't add up. The truth is that every 40 days, a woman loses about 900 eggs, whether she's ovulating or not, whether she's pregnant or not, whether she's breastfeeding or not. So let's keep that in mind, because Mother Nature really leveled the playing field as it related to fertility among women. Hormones. You can see that in the first column, labeled reproductive age, women make lots of hormones. Those hormones are dramatically reduced after a natural menopause, as seen here in column 2. Let's just say about 1/10 the amount of estrogen of the reproductive woman is seen during natural menopause, and even less, maybe 1/15 in women who have had surgery to remove their ovaries or had a surgical menopause. Testosterone and androstenedione, those triggers for sexual interest we talked about, they too are dramatically reduced at menopause. Let me say parenthetically that men have about 10 times as much testosterone and those triggers for sex as women do. Another subject for another day. We're talking about menopause. Menopause, hot flashes, perspiration, palpitations, mood changes, depression, insomnia, disturbed sleep from a variety of issues, urinary problems, vaginal discharge, dryness, pain with sex, itching, burning, oh my goodness, and associated with a large number of increasing disorders, all related to low levels of estrogen. Let's look at hot flashes just for a second. This is a complicated slide, but each of the arrows at the top indicates a hot flash. This is a woman who's recording her hot flashes while very carefully monitored. I want to point out that at the very bottom, you can see the finger temperature, which rises dramatically each time that woman has a hot flash, because her hands get very, very warm, as does her forehead, etc. But those hot flashes, here seen using a thermogram, begin at chest level. They start around the breast and they settle on the hands and face. Here you can see the face is white hot after a hot flash. What benefit could any of these have to a woman? Maybe none, maybe some. They last a variable period of time, but the majority of women, even though this study shows that they can last as long as 44 years, for the majority of women, hot flashes last somewhere between 1 and 5 years, with an average of about 4 years when they typically reduce on their own. So hot flashes don't last forever. They don't seem to serve a purpose in menopausal women, so why am I focusing on them? You've already heard some nice talks about the changes that occur in the vulvar and vaginal area, which cause unprecedented vaginal and vulvar pain in menopausal women, often limiting their urination, limiting their choice of undergarments, and limiting their sexual activity. Again, not very adaptive in our current understanding of the evolutionary circumstances of humans of today. But let's look at this in a broader evolutionary context. In menopause, there's an increase in cholesterol and other lipids. Those are associated with heart disease. There's an increase in calcium from the skeleton when estrogen is low. That leads to loss of bone density and increased risk of fracture. There's loss of muscle mass, so-called sarcopenia. That leads to frailty, weakness, and increased risk of death. Insomnia is not good for anything and can certainly reduce one's cognition. And we've been focusing a little bit on sex here, but a decrease in libido from vaginal dryness and painful intercourse, well, that leads to decreased receptivity to sexual activity, and in fact, may force males to seek sexual activity elsewhere for the benefit of the social group if we're living in a cave 50,000 years ago. There's decrease in skin thickness, which makes it thin and rife for injury. You've all seen that woman with paper-thin skin after menopause. That leads to death and increased risk of infection. So what was Mother Nature thinking when she came up with menopause? I think it wasn't an issue. She wasn't thinking about menopause or aging women at all. The focus was always about reproduction, the eat, reproduce, and die, not about menopause. In fact, the age of menopause has been very stable, about 51.3 years currently, for as long as we have recorded information. Let's look back to the 1850s. Imagine around the time of the Civil War. Women had a life expectancy under the age of menopause, about 43 years of age at the time of the Civil War. Now, there have always been long-lived individuals, both men and women, but not since modern times, let's say 1900, have women and men in large numbers lived beyond the age of menopause, age 51.3. The average life expectancy of a US woman is now 78.9. She's going to live more than a third of her entire life after menopause. And we in the US are constrained. It is that 78.9 white American, but African Americans and Native Americans live shorter, and Asian Americans much longer, up to 86.5 years on average. And we are 43rd in the world in terms of longevity, with Monaco leading the list with a gold medal of 89.4 years of average life expectancy. Putting all this together, what do we have? We have a plethora of women over the age of 50. That is to say, menopausal age. In fact, about 1 in every 7 humans in the US, men, women, children, 1 in every 7 is a menopausal woman. That's worthy of note. Let's talk about breastfeeding. And now I'm sure you think I've completely lost my mind because we're talking about menopause and aging and sex. Where does breastfeeding come in? Well, I hope to show you that breastfeeding is the only reason that Mother Nature knows about menopause. Remember, in a naturally menopausal woman, her estrogen levels are the same as the breastfeeding woman. Breastfeeding women have hot flashes. Breastfeeding women have vaginal dryness. Breastfeeding women have fatigue and sleep disturbance. Breastfeeding women have a reduced interest in sex. They have hot flashes. No different than the hot flashes in menopausal women. But think about this. Maybe the low estrogen levels in breastfeeding women actually carry an evolutionary advantage, not disadvantage. For example, insomnia might lead to increased vigilance, vigilance for the sound of your baby crying, okay? Decreased susceptibility to predation. Let's imagine we're living in that cave 50,000 years ago. The saber-toothed tiger is on the loose, and we know that in other animals, predation usually occurs on the weak and the sick and the aged. Well, what's weaker than a newborn human baby? Infant warming. Where do those hot flashes begin? About breast level, and they settle on the hands. Where are mom's hands? They're on the baby. Where is the baby? The baby's at breast level. And you can see very clearly that warming, like from hot flashes, might be beneficial to keeping that baby warm. And even though these babies are clothed because they're contemporary women breastfeeding, imagine we're back in that cave 50,000 years ago, no central heat, no central air, very little clothing, newborn babies. Low ovulation or decreased fertility, that's natural family planning and child spacing. And that can be from no menstrual cycles due to breastfeeding, or that can be from a lower libido, from pain with sex. So pain with sex might actually be beneficial in the context of breastfeeding your baby. Elevated fat and calcium in your blood leads to increased calcium and fat in the milk. Let's imagine skim milk versus high test. High test here being defined as lots of fat and calcium, good for the baby's development and good for the baby's bones. How long does breastfeeding last? In cultures that are primitive, the same amount of time that hot flashes last, somewhere in the 3 to 7 year range. Why else would hot flashes not be longer or shorter in the average woman? So in conclusion, let's think about this. Low estrogen can be beneficial during breastfeeding and detrimental following menopause. And in each case, I've attempted to outline for you here how that works. Blood flow is good for reproductive women. Milk with high amounts of fat and calcium, good for reproductive women. Decreased elasticity and pain with sex might actually be good in the context of breastfeeding, etc., whereas maladaptive, anti-evolutionary, bad for your health in the context of the post-reproductive era, where capillaries and increased fat in blood, cholesterol, could all be bad for cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. An increase in the amount of calcium coming out of the bones can clearly cause osteoporosis and fracture. No one that's menopausal wants to have sex if they're having pain from vaginal and genital atrophy. And memory problems, disturbed sleep, all of those are counterproductive in our current culture. So let's finish with this. This is an initial carving from the first edition in English of the Grimm's fairy tale, Hansel and Gretel. You all know the story. These two kids, Hansel and his baby sister, Gretel, get lost in the woods and follow a trail of breadcrumbs, which gets lost, and they end up at the Wicked Witch. Well, here's our Wicked Witch. She has a big, big nose and wears a scarf or a babushka on her head. Those are to cover the fact that she has androgen excess from her dramatic loss of estrogen at menopause. She's got canes to hold herself up because she's got osteoporosis and fracture. And let's not forget her mood. Her mood is such that she eats small children. She is, in fact, the caricature of the menopausal woman from the change from the 1800s to the 1900s, as illustrated by the Grimm's brothers. Let's hope for better in our current culture and healthier aging. Thanks a lot.